Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the last day of our Assembly's keynote speech, our second keynote speech of this Assembly. And it's comes at a really good time, I think, in the conversation, because during the last 2 days of this Assembly, I've heard a lot about the value of START Network, value of the START Network as a funder, as a connector, as a mechanism for leapfrogging systems change through collective problem identification and collective problem solving. But I've also heard a lot of challenge about how we're going to maintain that value as we transition from something global and centrally managed to something exciting and more collaborative, but where the mortar that holds us all together is potentially less obvious. So how to turn a network of now committed actors into a self-propelling, energized, and ambitious movement? How do we make space for the new connections that we're making, the new ideas, the diverse perspectives, but also speak and act as a collective and something is a movement for standing something particular? How do we find the right balance between being globally, how do we find the right space as supporting globally led reform agendas like the Grand Bargain, but make sure that they're rooted in the real life positioning of affected communities? I talk a lot about the START Network being locally positioned, but globally connected. And I really feel that that is our best positioning or where we stand, but what does that duality look like in practice? I think we haven't really seen what that looks like yet. But we are fortunate actually to have someone with us today that can help use her own experience to help us answer those questions and see that vision really clearly. Jenny Hodgson has been enabling her own network since 2006 as the executive director of the Johannesburg-based Global Fund for Community Foundations, which is another sort of movement for systems change. As the executive director of the Global Fund, she's overseen its emergence as a leading global voice on community philanthropy, as a core strategy for people-led development and for those power shifts. And based in Uganda, Kenya, Russia, Singapore, and Thailand, she's taken that thinking really globally, being involved in philanthropy development in all of those emerging markets and developing contexts alike. She's now a board member of the Africa Philanthropy Network and a trustee of Comic Relief. And to sort of interview Jenny and to hold conversation with her, I'd like to introduce Bhavia Srinivasan, who is, until recently, our head of network development at START Network, supporting and championing our hubs since 2016, so really for 5 very solid years. And previously to her head of network development role was part of the DEP Innovation Labs program, which supported community innovation to strengthen disaster preparedness. So I leave this conversation in the capable hands of Jenny and Bhavia. Let's get started. Thanks.
Okay, hi everybody. Just going to be, it's a real pleasure to be with you all today. I understand your keynote speaker on Monday was the amazing Cherno Bal, so I feel slightly intimidated stepping in his, coming into his footsteps after him. But as Christina said, what I really want to do today is to share from a different part of the ecosystem some of the things that we've learned over the last few years around systems change and specifically movement building. Just going to share my screen. So I'm going to share a few images to kind of get us thinking about all of this. I'm going to start off by talking about trees and gardens, because I think nature has a lot for us humans with our sticky structures to learn from. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the field of community philanthropy, which you may or may not be familiar with, but this is a relatively young body of practice and increasingly theory, which is both emergent and global and increasingly joined up. I want to talk a little bit about demand side versus supply side when one's thinking about systems change, and some ways of thinking that I found really useful in trying to understand systems change as a way of organizing one's work and one's thinking. And then I want to share with you about the Shift the Power movement. I should say that Shift the Power movement kind of came about almost by accident, really. We didn't intend to create a movement, but a movement seems to have been what has emerged. So during lockdown, I'm sure like many of you, when we were allowed out of our houses, we did a lot of walking, and I kind of became quite fascinated by trees. In fact, this tree is near my mother's house in the UK. I'm joining you today from Johannesburg, and this tree has been around for about 300 years. And you look at a structure like a tree that has seen so much, and how has it been so durable? All this time, it continues to be there. Its roots are deep. It continues to stand. And what can we learn from it? As I said, I'm joining you today from Johannesburg, where it is peak jacaranda season. So if I look out of my office window, I see this carpet of purple. It's stunningly beautiful. But if you know about jacarandas, you know that in South Africa, they are an invasive species. And in fact, Johannesburg has no natural source of water. And jacarandas are responsible for drinking the water of an already parched city. And I think there's something for us to be thinking about as we're thinking about our systems and structures, about what's invasive and what's organic, and what really suits the context in which we are all operating. Because too often, this development project, this development malarkey that we're all involved in, ends up with structures that look like this, things that once looked beautiful, but suddenly a few shocks, and suddenly, like tsunamis and storms increasingly cause in many of the communities that we work in, these structures simply don't last. Our analysis from the Global Fund for Community Foundations perspective, and it's one that's we've really kind of grown. We didn't set out to have an analysis of development aid. We set out some 15 years back to support the emergence of community philanthropy as a field, as a body of practice, working with funds and foundations, grassroots grant makers, local actors that were combining grant making, but also talking about local resource mobilization in different parts of the world. We set out to work with them, to support them, and to see, what this new kind of ecosystem of organizations that played a bridging role in their communities really looked like, and how we could better understand it. But over the years, I think this kind of analysis of what's wrong with the current system has really shaped our understanding of the importance of new and alternative structures. So in this picture, you've got the donor aid. It's a sort of this chilly building, bureaucratic money held kind of remotely, and handed out sort of in bags from afar often. And what we've got in our ecosystem of philanthropy and development is we've created structures, organizations that look sufficiently like the donors at the top of the pipeline to be able to unlock their money. So we've created mini structures of donors and more barriers. And I know that central to the Start Network's ethos is the idea of not doing this, but it's really hard not to do this. It's really hard not to be cut from the cloth of the source of your funding. And so often people have ended up being left out of this picture. There are these anonymous shapes at the front of this, at the bottom of this picture, that they become numbers and statistics. And what we really need for a robust and resilient and durable ecosystem is structures, is institutions that are visible, like these beautiful trees that have grown way above the forest floor and can be seen. If you imagine those institutional versions of those, they can be seen, they have power and they have voice. But the reason they're able to grow so tall is because of what's on the forest floor. So all those smaller plants, the culture, the context in which these trees must grow become a critically important part of what makes these trees grow. And if we're thinking about analogies in civil society, that our civil society structures and institutions need to have those deep roots into the communities they serve for the purposes of legitimacy and ownership and feeling like they belong in the context in which they are operating. They're not like jacarandas that have been transposed from one part of the world to another. So let me say a little bit about the framing of community philanthropy. And this picture here is from one of our partners in Nepal, Tewa, the Nepal Women's Fund. In a context like Nepal, which we know is aid dependent in so many ways, over the last 25 years, Tewa has built up a network of 5,000 individual donors, and those are women in communities. Those are some who are slightly better off with more disposable income. But TAWA has created a model of participatory giving and participatory resource mobilization. So the logic of community philanthropy is this, that all communities have assets, financial and non-financial, and that when you can actually make these visible and bring them to the table, they actually shift the dynamic where communities are no longer beneficiaries, they become co-investors in the equation. And that when people give together, when they contribute of their own and agree to do it together collectively, it actually strengthens the bonds between them. They move from being an I to being an us. And that is critical. That social capital is critical to strengthening the fabric of communities and societies. And that community philanthropy as a development strategy in this way helps to build collective power and voice, not just horizontal connections, I'm giving, you're giving, we are giving in community with each other, but actually creating something of a formidable force, which can then start to engage in more kind of linking social capital ways across power differentials. And this becomes a critical way of changing the dynamics of development aid. So we have partners, as I said, around the world. We have partners in 70 countries, some 200 plus organizations. Some would describe themselves as community foundations, women's funds, socio-environmental funds, civil society organizations. The pictures here are from China on the left, the Dalit Community Foundation that was established in Bihar, India a couple of years ago, where Dalit communities were starting to think about how they could also mobilize their own resources as a strategy for building their own voice and power. At the bottom on the right there, you've got some of our community philanthropy partners in Russia. In a constricted space like Russia, there are some 50, 60 community foundations mobilizing local resources in their community and building the fabric of community there. And there on the bottom on the left, from Zambia, the Zambia Governance Foundation, which has played a critical role in starting to introduce a conversation around the importance of local resources as a strategy for building local buy-in and ownership. And this quote at the top is from one of my favorite community foundations, not that I have favorites, obviously, which is in Selma, Alabama, the heart of the American Civil Rights Movement. And their whole philosophy is around taking what we have to make what we need. We start with us first, and then we look out to see what other resources are around us. So another way to kind of visualize this community philanthropy thing, and philanthropy might not be the word that you use in your own networks or context, but basically I'm talking about donor money, wherever it comes from. So this idea that actually if you can start to blend these different types of resources, so the top down from external actors, often with quite strong power connections and dynamics, the philanthropy or the giving with grassroots. So in many spaces in the philanthropic space, we're starting to see the emergence of participatory grant making and participatory decision making. So the money may come from outside, but the decision making is happening, is being done by those most affected by the issues in front of them. And at the bottom there, this idea of philanthropy by and from the grassroots, that actually if you can hold an image and a mechanism which can both receive external money and deploy it effectively, but also acknowledge and build on those local resources, then you start to get these different types of capital or monies talking to each other. What happens very often is that the money from outside comes like when you switch a hose pipe on too fast and you've grown some seedlings, and the water comes out of the pipe too quickly and suddenly your seedlings are all washed away. So how to get this container where you can actually see these different kinds of resources that come with different types of values. So external money may come with high financial value, but local money comes with high trust or social capital value. We know that this is a time of massive disruption in the philanthropy and international development space. And I think COVID, Black Lives Matter, this has really all come to the fore in the last year or so. The debates around decolonizing aid, the suggestion that the entire development industry is by nature racist and exclusionary. a lot of the conversations around systems change and power are happening on the supply side. They're happening amongst funders, they're happening amongst international actors. But what is also happening is we're starting to see this moment of emergence, the demand side of the equation. So the Shift the Power movement kind of fits into that. There was some amazing work done in Uganda during COVID that was looking at how communities gave during the period of COVID, and often in the absence of international money, much of which got stuck in the system and was impossible to spend. Actually, it was across Africa and many parts of the world, people putting their hands into their pockets to actually resource their own COVID response, and starting to document that and understand what role this kind of giving must play in a more fully evolved ecosystem, which can combine external and local resources. And starting to kind of unlock this sort of political muscle of probably decades of frustration experienced by many actors in the global South, who've been consistently told that they have no capacity, they can't be trusted. And we know that the shocking figures associated with the grand bargain and the localization agenda, quite how little money continues to reach local actors. And I direct you to that headline at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, which was a really interesting test for us for Shift the Power as a movement. This letter was published in February 2020, so shortly before the pandemic really kicked off. And it was an open letter to international NGOs, basically saying, stop coming into our countries and fundraising for your own activities and operations here. Instead, help us, local civil society, to strengthen our abilities to engage local people and local resources. And for me, it was a really interesting litmus test, because when we started circulating this letter through social media, within the course of a few days, we had 200 organizations, many of which we did not know, signing up to this letter and realizing actually there's a real power in organizing some political clout on the demand side of things. If we're talking about systems change, there are all sorts of devices and structures and clever things out there. I really like this model, which is really very simple, the Burkana 2 loops model of systems change. And I'll just park it with you here and you can go and think about it a bit later. But the idea is that systems are always changing, and invariably dominant systems rise and they fall. And you could think of the Roman Empire, or you could think of fossil fuels. They peaked and then they came to the end. And if you think about the international development aid system, actually that is that top loop, that sort of Bretton Woods and onwards to where we are now, where the world is changing. And we know that the current system cannot last as it has been for many, many reasons, both internal and external. And the space I think that we've been working with the networks of organizations that the Global Fund for Community Foundations is associated with is really almost not part of that dominant loop at all. Very few of our partners actually have direct engagement with that dominant international development system. Instead, for the last 15 years or so, we've been working in that connect space, which is where you start to actually, we would use open calls for proposals to say who out there is a community proximate or a community-based grant maker and is using grant making as a deliberate development tool, not because a donor has asked you to do it, but sees a value in grant making as a strategy for devolving power and resources to others to do things for themselves. So grant making was one of the parameters we looked at. Another one was around local resources. Are you starting to think about and explore the potential for mobilizing local resources as part of your resourcing plan? But also understanding that actually this was never really about money. It was really about kind of oiling the machinery of communities that trust each other and bringing together different parts of the community through giving and demonstrating how that giving could actually translate perhaps into small grants, which could actually produce good things at a community level. So much of the first 7 or 8 years of our work, I always say we operated in splendid isolation. People would go, oh, that's interesting, we don't do that. So we spent a good 7 or 8 years identifying grassroots grant makers, community development foundations, organizations that felt like they belonged in this family. They weren't issue-based NGOs. They were talking about local giving, they were grant making. So they had this in common with each other. But actually, it will come as no surprise to you that there are actually very few grant makers in the global south. There are many organizations that make grants because that's part of a contract they may have with a donor, but very few organizations that set out to use grant making as a development strategy. So the first years of our existence as a network was really to identify these different organizations around the world and to find out whether there was a there. Was this a distinct family? Was this a kind of missing piece of the development architecture? And by bringing groups together to be with each other, people started to say, yes, we are. We belong to a system, a sector. We play an important role that bridges the gap between big external money and what's happening at community level. And grant making is a critical part of what we do. It is one of the tools we use to deliver our strategy. And then more recently, and this is really where the Shift the Power movement came in, was to start to actually say, if we have this knowledge, this connection, this network, shouldn't we be more visible in the system? Don't we offer a missing piece that the system is apparently looking for? So we've sort of accompanied both the identification and the consolidation of networks to this more, the lower loop starting to come up there to where it says illuminate, to make this work more visible. And as this work starts to emerge and become more visible, starting to see within the dominant system that some things clearly must just die, their time is over. But what is good in the dominant system that can be part of that transition route where these two worlds can sort of converge and start to sort of see each other as part of a new, more equitable system. And I'm happy to come back to that. So just to finish, really to say a little bit about Shift the Power as a global movement. I always say we didn't intend to set up a movement. We were actually using Shift the Power as a hashtag back in 2016 in relation to the first global summit on community philanthropy. And at that meeting, what we really wanted to do was to say, this isn't just for people who do community philanthropy. This is for people who are interested in the element of power or the lack of it or the misuse of it in the development system, and to really embrace the kinds of emergent practices that we were seeing out there. So community philanthropy, participatory grant making, all sorts of innovations that were happening at the edges, driven by people on the ground who were interested in their work being more equitable, reaching people who weren't normally reached. And interestingly, many of the leaders of the organizations we work with were people themselves who had worked in the dominant system previously and at some point had just stepped out and started really to design from scratch. So back in 2016, we didn't really have a communications budget. We are a really small organization. We doubled in size earlier this year. So we went from 2 to 4 full-time staff. So we, just to get things in proportion here. So it really was, and when we started using Shift the Power as the hashtag, over the days of the event itself, it just went viral, and it felt like we had touched a nerve, which was too often Southern civil society tries to explain its value in the context of what the dominant system needs. And for the first time, this kind of put the word power on the table, and to say we must acknowledge that there is a power imbalance. And what I want to say too, which is really important, is that consistently within our network, when we're talking about power, yes, there is a conversation about north-south power imbalances and dynamics, but as important, and often actually even more importantly, our partners are more concerned about the extent to which they may hold and not share power. Because if you start to build local resources, if you start to make grants, actually you're in danger of becoming a gatekeeper yourself. And so the sort of strategies that some of our partners use to continually think about how their structures continue to devolve power through participatory approaches. One partner, in fact, the woman on the bottom right-hand corner of the picture, who is from one of our partners in India, runs a radical audit every year where they invite their partners just to come into the office and look through their paperwork and just say, let's be accountable to you for once. So in thinking about mobilizing these energies, and I would say this is Shift the Power is grounded in community philanthropy, but actually it has a much larger constituency now. We realized we needed to bring broad alliances of people together who wanted a different kind of system. Community philanthropy may be the entry point, but it may be something else. It may be around decolonization. It may be about fundamentally different kinds of things, but there's a vision here. And that is of a future that's negotiated, participatory, and widely owned. And the concept of movement generosity, how we need to move away from the competitive system that we're in, where if I get the grant and you don't, I've won. So why would I share anything with you? Because next time you might get the grant. How do we start seeing ourselves as a system, as a movement, that the stronger we are together, the louder our voice can be and our ability to advocate for change. And on the right there, this was a manifesto for change, which was to move really from we exist as a sector, we have some shared interests and some aspirations. Actually, let's start drawing a vision of the future that we want based on the principles of a good society, moving away from the parameters, the straitjacket of international development, because international development locks you into a conversation about international development, not about the kinds of societies and spaces that we want to live in and of our children to grow up in. I love this quote because it really has explained to me some of the logic of what we have been doing over many years now, which is working with hyperlocal actors who themselves are working with even more hyperlocal partners and communities. This idea that if you really want to think about systems change, you cannot use large-scale solutions. Large-scale problems require small-scale solutions, but held together within a large-scale framework. And with Shift the Power, I think that's one of the things we've tried to do, is to hold that space, to provide that container, that framework in which lots of important emergent practices and ways of working can start to emerge. Just to go back to the gardens and biology slides from earlier, we know that our institutions need to have deep roots into the ground, and that the deeper the roots, the stronger the tree will be. But trees' roots are effective thanks to something else, and that's to fungi, mycorrhizal fungi, which have been around for 500 million years. It's these that interact at the ends of the roots of the trees, the ones that are able to actually help the roots be more effective, more efficient, that can actually channel the resources from the ground, the water upwards, the nutrients and such. And I think for me, in the context of our work, it really is the idea that yes, money matters, but too often money has become the way that we frame our discussions around development. It is around flows of money and an assumption that money flows from the global north to the global south. But money without trust does nothing. In fact, our most important currency really is trust. Money that falls on trust can go so much further, but trust is such a valuable currency that we need to kind of wrap our arms around and really articulate. So I'm going to leave you with this final image of Shift the Power really as a kind of a bold proposition to which no one holds the answers, but if we work together, we can collectively perhaps arrive there sooner. But it is this idea that we need new ways of doing and deciding, that the old ways are wrong and they're broken and they're premised on a system which is top-down, short-term, fraught with power dynamics, and that there are some things that we can put at the center of this alternative system. One is we can be global, we can be networked, we can be joined up, we can exercise solidarity, and we can stand together and we can stand alongside each other. We can express our collective voice. The idea of emergent practice, that good practices emerges in the context of context and what's around people, what works, and too often that gets overlooked or dismissed. We need to use different kinds of measurements. Too often we're measuring what money buys rather than what really changed. So we have a whole learning community around measuring what matters. We need to put people and not money at the center of this. And we need to think of a vision that's based on assets. And at the bottom there, I love this image of the idea that we need to warm up these chilly bureaucracies, the top-down models of kind of engineering type delivery of development aid. We need to warm them up by embedding in them some of the ways that communities and their resources and the connections and relationships that matter to them really work. I will stop there. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow, thank you so much, Jenny. That was a lot that you gave us to sort of think about and digest and maybe relate to in terms of the work that we're trying to do as well. Maybe I'll pick up like the last one of the last things you spoke about in terms of trust, and we've been hearing that quite a bit in conversations over the last 2 days. And what do you think? What are the conditions for that to actually happen, right? Like we all intrinsically want to trust, and we want to start from a trust-based sort of location. But what are some of the things how does that look in practice in such a network and within the communities that you're working with? I think like we have a very Western centric notion of what that looks like, but how does it actually look on the ground from your experience?
So it's interesting. One of the things I've observed that when one talks about trust in the dominant system, it's often trust between INGOs and their partners. That's the default. That's it. For us, it didn't start there. And I have to say that we have been unburdened by the fact of not having much money. So we don't, our grants are always small. So that in the first place allows for a more open conversation, in that no one is trying to really, firstly, you really have to want our grants to apply for them. And you can tell, because for many people, this agenda is just, they're not ready for it. Many people are happy with the system that's there. So we came at trust from a different perspective. Our question was, why, if you're in Nepal or in Uganda, where there's so much development aid, you could write a proposal tomorrow and get that money immediately. Why are you bothering to talk about local money? And then why, if you're getting that local money, why then are you giving it away to someone else? That is the definition of madness in a context where civil society is perhaps not trusted, levels of trust are low. And so when we got beyond the demographic data, we could say how much money we could see how much money people were raising, the size of grants they were making. It was very clear that this was never about money. This was about modeling an alternative system based on trust. And then actually trust was, for example, if people come together and decide to contribute funds towards something similar, it may be the first time they've met. So it is an act of trust to do that, and actually building that collective voice. And similarly with grantee partners, bringing them together to create the conditions for them to be with each other and begin to build trust. And interestingly, for example, I mentioned Tewa in Nepal. What they do is they really encourage their grantee partners to give back, not in the form separately from their grants, but to give back to Tewa, with the logic that actually if they give back, then they become co-investors as well. They're not just beneficiaries. So we've seen trust as a key kind of driver of this work. And then from that, you kind of have to work backwards so where does the trust then live in other parts of the system? But I think that, the default is to assume that one could talk about trust and admit for it to happen when you've got power imbalances. But actually, it really is actually development as trust building or dignity building or that. So it kind of flips it on its head. And then starting to look at what are the kinds of metrics that you can use to determine the extent to which bonding, bridging, or linking social capital is built using things like social network analysis, or even just anecdotal evidence, who spoke to whom this time, who'd never spoken to each other before, for example.
Thank you. I think you've sort of answered a question that's come from the audience as well in terms of that second part of what you were talking about. So how do you actually sort of measure that in terms of how do you demand it, and how do you see that is actually happening through some of these new types of metrics of doing things and doing it from a community perspective which is quite different from how we would potentially take out like our measuring tape in terms of tick boxes that we are trying to find. Are there other experiences that you've had where where you can give us some examples of how this has been done differently in terms of the metrics that you were sort of talking about? Because I think that would be interesting for us to think about how we think about how change happens as well.
Yeah. So, and again, I say, I have this brilliant position where I just get to see the work these amazing organizations are doing and then kind of try and distill it together. So a couple of years ago, we brought together, we came up with a hypothesis that community philanthropy is about building assets. It's about building the agency of others. So grant making is a deliberate tool for doing that. And it's a strategy for building trust. And if you can do that, then you can actually start talking about power and shifting it. But actually, these things are all sit alongside each other. Because it takes trust to pool resources, and then trust for those that are creating longer term reserves and endowments to say that in the future, someone won't run away with our money kind of thing. So it's kind of modeling new kinds of trust relationships. But we brought together 15 of our partners a couple of years ago to say, actually, what are the metrics we might use? And in the course of some interviews we did with our partners, everyone was collecting data that they couldn't quite account for why they were collecting it, but they felt like it was important. And we joked about everyone had their secret spreadsheet. That it was like, who came to our office, who came to which meetings, who spoke, who came back the next time? Like, actually, how do we follow the behaviors in our community of people? Who start to hang out with whom? Who started to do projects together? And actually, and this data was being collected, but they felt like they didn't know what to do with it, and nor was there an audience for it. So I think there's something about that the importance of, what matters, what trust looks like or doesn't look like. So actually, how do we first legitimize that as a conversation, that it's a broad bucket that can have trust in it, and then you can work out what it means. But I think there's something also about the lack of trust in Southern actors from external actors. So people always sort of say to me, but how do you trust them to do this? Like, if we give money for grant making, how do we trust But you think, if somebody in your community, and I mentioned the Black Belt Community Foundation, I think it's a brilliant example. So in the deep south of the United States, most of the wealth is held by white people, the political power is held with Black people, but actually, the economics of that part of the world are really shocking, a sort of third world country in a first world one. And Felicia Lucky, who is the founder of the Black Belt, she's the director of the Black Belt Community Foundation, she knew that she needed African Americans to feel like this was their institution. And she said the biggest metric for her personally as to whether she was on track or not was that every month, an elderly lady in the community, she would put her best clothes on, wear her hat, she would go down to the ATM and she would withdraw $50. And she would come and then deposit it in person at the office of the community foundation. And that, if you can imagine that in whether you're in Kenya or Mexico, ever, somebody gives once and then they give again. And each time they give, it is an indicator of trust and them finding you accountable. So it's like we sometimes think that our own top-down indicators are the only ones that matters, but actually these are proxy indicators, but legitimate indicators for exactly these same sorts of things. But the doer and the verifier is a different one. And it's, again, it comes back to power. It's like, yeah, but I want my boxes ticked, So I do think there are ways of doing it. And actually evidence of giving and how people give and the ways that they give is such an important metric of buy-in. Of course, it's not a fully baked system yet in many parts of the global south for people to be able to give and give easily. But unless we grow that pipeline and condition that idea that this is actually about active citizenship and voice and participation, this is the critical part of it.
I might shift us a little bit, because I think it's very interesting what you're saying in terms of the community and how there's so much social capital there. And within the humanitarian system, we're so used to sort of interventions being designed at the individual level or a household level. And we're sort of almost missing the social capital of the community there. And we don't think about that agency that they bring. And is this an oversight that you think you recognize within the sector that we work in? And you think it sort of, again, reflects the Western mindset of that we need to challenge quite fundamentally in terms of the way sort of we're talking about decolonization and colonial systems that exist?
Yes. I mean, I think there is a dynamic, it's like with funders, you only exist if I fund you. If I no longer fund you, you fall out of my ecosystem. So this inability to see ecosystems, or an INGO with its partners thinking about how do we make our partners sustainable, but maybe those partners aren't the right ones, the legitimate ones. It's more rather than how do we create a context in which our partners, if they want to, can thrive in the context of broader alliances and beyond categories. I think it's critically important. If you think, we know already that when disaster hits, it's communities that help each other. And if there are community structures that are supported, and I think this has happened consistently within our network, both in kind of large scale events like the Nepal earthquake, but also more of the smaller kinds of floodings and stuff that we're going to see more of. Actually, trusted local organizations are the ones people go to. And they don't say, do you have a background in disaster response? They say, we know you, trust you, what you're going to do. And often these institutions also have the networks, so they can find out who's where. I remember a partner in Bosnia after some severe floods there a few years ago. And this is an organization that has been making grants in the community and talking about local resource mobilization. And when there were massive floods, I think somebody from INGO, which I won't name, came to Bosnia and they came to the foundation. They said, we really quite disparagingly, we don't really understand how you can make grants so quickly, with the suggestion being that this was bad grant making. And the organization said, we can make grants quickly because we knew who to give grants to, and we knew people were giving to us, and we knew the community. And I think that limited framework, which is I must follow the money, so therefore, even if I'm funding individuals, I can only look at that rather than individuals in the context of their networks and their communities. And I think it's a sort of dogged insistence of sort of the egotism, and probably often quite unconscious egotism of structures that sort of basically say, I can only see myself in the mirror, the thing I funded that exists. So really, and I think it's a critical question, is how do we see different resources and different systems, in the context of holistic systems, rather than I'm supporting this bit and you're supporting this bit, which is, you just a drop in the ocean kind of thing.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And I think we think about like collaboration of saying like, oh, you're doing your piece of work and I'll do my piece of work. And that's where like the system lens sort of gets missed as well, and how we do things. I was also wanting to pick up on that transition space that you were talking about, and you said you'd come back to it as well. It's a really interesting one in terms of like you're not losing everything from the old system. There are some bits of the old system that are good that you want to continue on. But I was just wondering on like, how do you identify that, and who sort of makes those decisions about like what are those pieces that get carried over, and how does that how do you ensure equity in a very broad sense when you're sort of making those decisions, when you're sort of moving from one to another?
Yeah, I mean, it's a critical question. And I think no one does. They have to offer themselves as contributing to this alternative system. I know that Bond in the UK did a process on systems change and, reflecting on how things could be done differently. And one of the barriers that they identified was the inability of the system to see emergent alternatives. So I think firstly is to see what else is out there. Secondly is to kind of park one's ego and observe, and then see if anything that one has in any way relates to that. And I think, the humanitarian aid system is a really interesting one, because what we have been talking about as community philanthropy, I think the humanitarian system has called country-based pooled funds. So that the technical design of these things is not dissimilar, but the origins are very different. And country-based pooled funds have sort of been landed in places without even checking to see if there was, the potential for something that the humanitarian space might call a country-based pooled fund, for example. And because we like neatness in the development system, you don't want to kind of work with alliances towards bringing people together. It really is, well, let's just set it up and do it. So I think it's actually it's the lack of pathways between the emergent and the design system. Where are those conversations happening? Where are people prepared to take a risk? A couple of months back, we did a conference. It was an online conference called, rather provocatively, Localization, Local Philanthropy and Power. And we called it that because we wanted to put these different buckets that don't sit alongside each other, localization and local philanthropy. These are like cut from completely different aspects of the system, but to say actually these things are joined up, and really how do we mash them together and say, look, these are the pieces. There's an agenda and a commitment, there's the emergent something else, and there's the issue of power. And in organizing that, and it was a very very diverse group of actors. So we worked with the NEAR Network, we were with the West Africa Civil Society Institute, Save the Children Denmark. The boldness of that was actors coming together who had never hung out in each other's spaces before, and actually who didn't really understand the language of each other, and to work together to say, when you say that, is that the same as when I say this? And I think that's something we're really bad at. It's like, do I speak your language? Okay, I'm in. Do I not? Then I'm out. So I think, it's that commitment to bold and unusual alliances and experimentations, which is where one would surface whether what's in that transition bucket has indeed something else to land, because we know there are pockets of fantastic stuff, but they're essentially caught in flawed structures. So their ability to change anything is by definition limited.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting on the mindset as well, where you sort of need to put your ego aside and really come to the table to be able to sort of see things afresh and like allow for emergence. And I guess for the next bit about the emergence and what you had said initially, where that's first 7 years where you were sort of really just taking time to understand what that space was. How important is that in terms of like allowing for emergence to occur, like the time factor? There's such a rush always, and there's a speed, there's a need to have done it like 3 days ago. And like, what is the mindset there that you feel will help us sort of feel comfortable dealing with that ambiguity and giving us permission to sort of take our time? How important is time?
Yeah, I mean, our 7 years in the wilderness were because no one was interested in funding this. We had a few core funders, and so it didn't feel, it's only in retrospect that I realized actually we were saved from those pressures of having to deliver. But I think systemically, what I see is time. We know as humans, if you rush things, they're not going to be good. Isn't that the first thing our parents tell us? Just slow down a bit. So systemically, how do we carve out the spaces for experimentation where we share risks? No one wants to take risks, but actually, how do we share? If we really want to support emergence, it needs commitment, it needs quiet, it needs safe spaces, it needs people looking in each other in the eye saying, let's give this time and not determine the outcomes. And that requires bravery. And to, as long as people feel it's not worth it because the system is just, it's bad, but it still works, I can get stuff done, there are no incentives for that. And so I see the importance, we need to carve out these spaces for that. Otherwise, we won't change anything. I mean, if you're building a new house because the other one's fallen down, you would actually probably get an architect and spend some time thinking about what it looked like, rather than just start building it and hoping it will more or less work. So I think systemically, it requires the commitment of broad alliances of actors actually to dedicate themselves to this and not put their institutional egos at the center of it, but actually think systems. And I think, the carrots and sticks that donors can provide, because they do, after all, have carrots and sticks, become critically important here.
Completely understand where you're coming from, and I couldn't agree more. I guess, like, just to sort of turn it back to Start Network a little bit, and to sort of like get your perspective on what you think would be sort of, what would you encourage us to do? What would you encourage us to be courageous about? What's the big sort of opportunity we need to not miss? Because I think, like you said, we're on that curve, we're on the wave. There's a new system that is emerging, but like, yeah, how do you encourage us to like sort of grab that opportunity?
I mean, it's a tricky one because of where you're starting from, in that there is a parent-child relationship, there's a danger of a franchising relationship, and all of these things undermine that ability to legitimize emergence. But I think it is about encouraging everyone involved in your network to get to the point where they can say, no, thank you, we don't need you. We don't belong to you anymore. And that to me is about building these broader alliances of actors, of people not being polite and just kind of venting, offline, but being able to express frustration and to start thinking about alternatives, because it's not just about what is it that the Start Network is going to do. It's actually, what do we want? what do we want to look like? In an ideal world, if we were starting from scratch and we said, what is this thing we need in our country that would allow us to respond in this way? What would it look like? Who would support it? Who would own it? And then to start really kind of building from that out. I mean, you have so much of the architecture bits, but are they in the right order? You know, is this a house or a caravan kind of thing? So I think it's really about, you know, it is about that. Let that demand side grow. Encourage, you know, of you know, people who are on at this conference now, really kind of thinking about who are your allies out there. That it's not just about your institution. It really is like, who would I sit down with? Who's doing good stuff? How can we join forces? And actually, that maybe part of the next process is the design of structures which blend all these things. It gets away from categories, and it really is the sort of the civil society we want, in the context of a good society we want, not international development and in securing money gets from A to B, because that is just, it's a road to nowhere. You know, it's just a kind of series of accountancy entries. It's not really about the kind of, this is about people, this is about dignity, this is about freedom, this is about equity, this is rights, justice, and structures, you know, the power of structures that are there long term, that can respond to the changing and diverse needs of their community. And by the fact of being there, proximate, community-based, actually can look across, can weave across issues and bring people in, becomes really a very, very powerful kind of, you know, the resources that communities and societies need.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I'm just going to hand over to Christina, who might want to come in. I know we could continue chatting for much longer. Unfortunately, our time is quite limited, but thank you so much. That was just so inspiring, but I'll hand over to Christina.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Bhavia, for being such a great discussant in this conversation. And thanks, Jenny, for all of your wonderful imagery and your wonderful insights into what we're doing and the way that we need to think of ourselves potentially differently and taking us through your own journey of how that happened. And I love that you say you were sort of under the radar for so long to just kind of get on with what you were doing without organizational pressure or system pressure. And I think that is a luxury that I wish that we had, but we have what we have to work with. Maybe just to sum up a few things that I take away from this and some real challenges from you for us at Start Network. And, you know, one thing you said was beware of the parent-child relationship, that we may have the right pieces of the architecture in place, but are we ordering them? Have we done this in the right sequence? Are we ordering them? Are we putting cart before horse? Are we putting house before caravan? I don't know. There's lots of different analogies in there, but beware of that, of the way we go about setting up that architecture and encouraging it. Also, beware of becoming a gatekeeper. I noted earlier in the conversation that as a funder, even as a funder that's trying to do things differently, we may put in place our own gatekeeping that we think is much more progressive than anybody else has done, but still we will be acting as a gatekeeper. And how do we avoid falling into that trap? And then, you know, just the kind of continue to look at that end state. What do we want it to look like? What do we want to see? What do we want to be? What does a better alternative look like? And just keep working toward that rather than trying to retrofit what we've already got going on. And I think, you know, yeah, it's a challenge to do. We are sort of a product of the system that we're trying to change. And I always think that we fall into a real tension all the time as that. But I guess I'm just also left with some of that brilliant imagery from the beginning, the trees and the forest floor. And I think of another image that has always been battered around in the aid sector of the temple and the marketplace, where you've got the temple, which you sort of had two of the pillars and the donors, the big institutions, and then the marketplace that kind of sits alongside it, but very separate. And I like your image so much more of trees and ground cover, because I think it's a much more, the temple and the marketplace are two very distinct things, whereas the trees and the ground cover are more about, are more organic, more mutual, and more sort of mutually nourishing. And I love that idea that we can take the best of what each of us has to offer and bring it together in a much more organic way, rather than think of ourselves as really distinct systems that somehow have to find their way in parallel. So that's just it. But thanks, you've given us so much to think about and such great insights. I really appreciate you being here. And thanks, Bhavia, for making this a really interesting conversation. Take care to both of you. And thanks for listening, everyone else. Bye-bye.
Thank you.